Between 1853 and 1856, Britain and France fought Russia in the Crimean War, not over ideology, not over trade routes, over collapsing Ottoman territory that everyone knew was up for grabs. Fast forward to 2025. China is building military installations on artificial islands in the South China Sea. Russia has planted a flag on the Arctic seabed. 7 nations are disputing rocks and reefs that barely break the surface at high tide. Why? Because when empires enter their final stage, the fight stops being about growth and becomes about holding ground. Territory becomes the last proof that power still exists. Here's what history shows. Early empires expand through innovation, trade, and opportunity. They grow because they offer something others want. Late empires do something completely different. They shift to force, financing, and logistics. The moment an empire stops growing, its relationship with territory fundamentally changes. Land is no longer something you acquire because it's profitable. It becomes something you must control to prove you're still dominant. And that shift triggers a very specific kind of conflict, one that follows the same structure every single time. This isn't theory. Between 1816 and 1950, forced territorial acquisition through armed conflict dominated global politics. After 1950, that trend collapsed. A norm against seizing territory emerged from the ashes of 2 world wars. But something's changing again. Conflicts have risen 40% since 2020. Analysts give a crisis in the Taiwan Strait or Russia-NATO clashes an even chance of happening in 2026. Xi Jinping issued warnings about Taiwan reunification being unstoppable on the last day of 2025. The pattern is reasserting itself. What makes late empire territorial wars different from early expansion? Scale and dependency. When Rome was expanding during the Republic, corruption actually fueled conquest. Generals and senators got rich from wars, and that ambition benefited the state. Territorial expansion paid for itself. But when empires mature, wars become attritional. They stop generating wealth and start consuming it. You're not conquering productive new regions anymore. You're defending symbolic positions that drain resources, and that changes who profits. Late-stage territorial conflict doesn't run on conquest economics. It runs on supply economics. You need constant flows of materials, energy, financing, and technology just to maintain position. Early empires could live off plunder. Late empires need infrastructure, and that infrastructure consolidates into the same institutional players across every historical cycle. Start with the foundation. Territory must be taken and held, which requires explosives and materials on an industrial scale. This isn't about a single battle. Attritional wars reward suppliers who can deliver endlessly. DuPont emerged during America's expansion phase, but became indispensable once wars shifted from growth to maintenance. When empires stop expanding, conflicts stretch longer. Borders matter more. The consumption of ordnance explodes because you're not advancing toward victory. You're preventing loss. Then there's energy. Territory without fuel is just a map. Late empires fight with machines, not masses of soldiers. The Rockefeller family built dominance by understanding that energy flows equal military capability. As empires matured through the 20th century, securing fuel routes became more important than conquering populations. This is why modern territorial disputes center on choke points and supply lines. The South China Sea isn't valuable because of the islands. $3.36 trillion in trade passes through it annually. 80% of China's energy imports flow through those waters. Fuel transforms geography into leverage. Declining empires face a brutal paradox. They must spend more while producing less. How do they bridge that gap? Financing. J.P. Morgan perfected large-scale war financing, enabling governments to fight beyond their immediate economic capacity. Late empires borrow to preserve influence. Debt becomes a substitute for the growth they no longer have. Once territorial conflicts are financed through debt, retreat becomes politically impossible. You've mortgaged your future to defend your present. This is why wars at the end of empires drag on long after they stop making strategic sense. Technology enforces what economics enables. Late-stage wars aren't fast conquests, they're prolonged enforcement actions. Lockheed Martin rose to prominence as warfare became technological. Aircraft, surveillance systems, and deterrence infrastructure replaced mass armies. Borders stopped being lines on maps and became zones enforced by airspace control and radar coverage. The cost overruns that plague modern weapons systems aren't bugs. They're features of permanence. Advanced weapons aren't designed to win quickly. They're designed to prevent loss indefinitely. None of this works without logistics. You can hold territory on a map, but if you can't supply it, you don't control it. Halliburton specialized in making occupied territory operationally usable. They turned conquered or contested land into zones where military forces could actually function. Late empire wars depend less on the drama of conquest and more on the mundane reality of maintaining presence. Roads, bases, fuel depots, supply chains. This is what transforms symbolic territory into actual control. Notice the pattern. Economic growth slows, legitimacy weakens. Territory becomes symbolic rather than productive. Conflict erupts to prove strength. Specialized institutions activate to supply, finance, and sustain the fight. War becomes prolonged. Costs rise, but withdrawal becomes unthinkable. This loop appeared at the end of ancient empires. It appeared at the end of colonial empires. And it's appearing now. Why do the same types of institutions show up every time? Because late empires can't improvise. They rely on existing supply chains, trusted contractors, and established financial systems. Territorial conflict at this stage isn't chaotic. It's highly structured. And that structure concentrates power into predictable hands. The players change names across centuries, but their functions remain identical. So when you see great powers fixating on border regions, strategic territories, and influence zones today, understand what you're watching. This behavior doesn't signal confidence. It signals transition. The institutions that supply late empires don't just appear when crisis hits. They're already embedded in the system. They wait. And when territorial conflict begins, they activate. Let's examine how this works in practice. Start with the first pillar. Explosives and materials. Territory must be taken and held. Modern territorial war isn't a single decisive battle. It's sustained pressure over months or years. That requires constant supply. Explosives aren't optional. They're foundational. DuPont emerged during America's early expansion phase. Initially, they supplied commercial operations, mining, construction, infrastructure. But as the United States matured, something shifted. Wars stopped being about seizing new frontiers. They became about maintaining borders and projecting force into contested regions. DuPont became indispensable not because wars grew more frequent, but because they grew longer, attritional. When you're not conquering for growth, but defending for credibility, consumption patterns change. You're not stockpiling for a single campaign. You're feeding an ongoing operation. This is what late empire conflict looks like. Not expansion. Entrenchment. And entrenchment rewards suppliers that can scale endlessly without innovating constantly. Now layer in the second pillar. Energy. Territory without fuel is just a map. Late empires don't fight with masses of soldiers anymore. They fight with machines, aircraft, vehicles, ships, systems that consume energy at rates previous generations couldn't imagine. The Rockefeller family understood this before most governments did. They built dominance by recognizing that energy flows equal military capability. As empires matured through the 20th century, securing fuel routes became more important than conquering populations. This is why modern territorial disputes center on choke points and supply lines. The South China Sea isn't valuable because of the islands themselves. $3.36 trillion in trade passes through it annually. 80% of China's energy imports flow through those waters. 40% of China's total trade moves along those routes. Fuel transforms geography into leverage. Without energy access, your military becomes stationary. Your economy grinds down. This is why conflicts over seemingly insignificant territories escalate so quickly. They're not fighting over rocks. They're fighting over flow. Declining empires face a brutal paradox. They must spend more while producing less. How do they bridge that gap? Financing. This is the third pillar. J.P. Morgan perfected large-scale war financing during a period when governments needed to fight beyond their immediate economic capacity. Late empires borrow to preserve influence. Debt becomes a substitute for the growth they no longer have. Once territorial conflicts are financed through debt, retreat becomes politically impossible. You've mortgaged your future to defend your present. This is why wars at the end of empires drag on long after they stop making strategic sense. The cost isn't just measured in casualties. It's measured in obligations that compound annually. Every year you continue costs more than the year before. But every year you've already spent makes walking away feel like total loss. The financing structure creates its own momentum, and the institutions providing that financing aren't neutral. They profit from continuation, not resolution. Technology enforces what economics enables. This is the fourth pillar. Late-stage wars aren't fast conquests. They're prolonged enforcement actions. Lockheed Martin rose to prominence as warfare became technological. Aircraft, surveillance systems, and deterrence infrastructure replaced mass armies. Borders stopped being lines on maps and became zones enforced by airspace control and radar coverage. The cost overruns that plague modern weapons systems aren't bugs. They're features of permanence. Advanced weapons aren't designed to win quickly. They're designed to prevent loss indefinitely. Each system requires maintenance, updates, training, integration. The complexity creates dependency, and dependency creates recurring revenue for decades. When a declining empire invests in these systems, they're not just buying weapons. They're buying into a technological ecosystem that becomes impossible to exit. The initial purchase is just the entry fee. The real cost is the commitment to maintain operational capability forever. None of this works without logistics. You can hold territory on a map, but if you can't supply it, you don't control it. This is the fifth pillar. Halliburton specialized in making occupied territory operationally usable. They turned conquered or contested land into zones where military forces could actually function. Roads, bases, fuel depots, supply chains. Late empire wars depend less on the drama of conquest and more on the mundane reality of maintaining presence. Logistics is what transforms symbolic territory into actual control. Without it, your forces can't eat, can't move, can't operate. The territory might fly your flag, but it doesn't serve your interests. This is why so many territorial disputes become frozen conflicts. The initial seizure is dramatic, the occupation is expensive, and walking away means admitting that all the logistical investment was wasted. So the presence continues, year after year, justified by sunk costs rather than strategic value. Notice the pattern. Economic growth slows, legitimacy weakens, territory becomes symbolic rather than productive. Conflict erupts to prove strength. Specialized institutions activate to supply, finance, and sustain the fight. War becomes prolonged. Costs rise, but withdrawal becomes unthinkable. This loop appeared at the end of ancient empires. It appeared at the end of colonial empires. And it's appearing now. The players change names across centuries, but their functions remain identical. The suppliers of explosives, the controllers of energy, the providers of financing, the builders of weapons systems, the operators of logistics. They don't cause the conflicts, but they make prolonged territorial struggle possible and profitable. When you see great powers fixating on border regions, strategic territories, and influence zones today, understand what you're watching. This behavior doesn't signal confidence. It signals transition. Empires that can't expand inward compensate by tightening grip outward. Territory becomes the substitute for legitimacy. When populations stop believing the story, borders become the only argument left. This is where power freezes, not through growth, but through enforcement. The South China Sea isn't contested because it suddenly became valuable. It's contested because the powers surrounding it have stopped expanding economically at rates that justify their political structures. $3.36 trillion in trade passes through those waters annually. 80% of China's energy imports flow through that corridor. But the real value isn't economic, it's positional. Whoever controls those reefs, atolls, and shipping lanes controls the narrative of dominance in Asia. China's 9-dash line isn't a legal claim. It's a declaration that their imperial moment hasn't ended. The artificial islands aren't military bases in the traditional sense. They're monuments, physical proof planted in contested waters, saying we are still here, we still matter, we still dictate terms. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, they're not resisting occupation. They're resisting irrelevance in their own region. Every water cannon incident, every radar lock, every near collision is both sides refusing to accept the transition that's already underway. The Arctic follows identical logic. Russia plants flags on the seabed under the North Pole, not because there's immediate value there, because climate change is opening access to resources that were frozen for millennia. Oil, natural gas, rare earth metals. But more importantly, the Northern Sea route. As ice melts, shipping lanes that were impassable become viable. Whoever controls Arctic waters controls an alternative to current choke points. Putin's 2035 Arctic strategy isn't about resource extraction. It's about positioning Russia as indispensable in a world where their conventional power is declining. They're building military facilities across territory that's becoming accessible for the first time. 7 of 8 Arctic nations are now NATO members. The 8th is Russia. That's encirclement from their perspective. So they claim 70% of the Arctic Ocean based on underwater ridge interpretations that no international body accepts. The claim isn't meant to be legally sound. It's meant to be militarily enforceable. Territory as the last proof of strength. Taiwan sits at the center of the most dangerous territorial calculation happening right now. Xi Jinping's warnings about reunification being unstoppable aren't about Taiwan itself. They're about whether China's rise continues or plateaus. If China cannot absorb Taiwan, the narrative of inevitable Chinese dominance breaks. 80% of the world's advanced semiconductors are produced there. Lose access to that production, and technological leadership shifts. But the strategic weight goes deeper. Taiwan represents the first island chain, the barrier between China's coastal waters and the open Pacific. As long as Taiwan remains outside Beijing's control, China's navy operates in a bathtub that can be sealed off. Reunification isn't about reclaiming lost territory. It's about breaking free from geographical containment. The military exercises encircling the island aren't practice. They're demonstrations. Rehearsals for the moment when economic growth no longer justifies political authority and force becomes the only remaining option. Ukraine demonstrates the pattern from the opposite angle. Russia's invasion wasn't about NATO expansion or protecting Russian speakers. Those are justifications, not causes. The cause is that Russia's post-Soviet claim to great power status rests entirely on geography and military capability. They produce little the world wants except energy and weapons. Their population is shrinking. Their economy is smaller than Italy's. But they have nuclear weapons and vast territory. Losing Ukraine means losing the buffer that makes European Russia defensible. It means losing access to the Black Sea. It means accepting that the Soviet collapse was permanent and Russia is now a regional power, not a global one. So the war continues, not because victory is achievable, but because admitting defeat means admitting irrelevance. The longer it drags on, the more it reveals the infrastructure that makes prolonged territorial struggle possible. The weapon systems, the financing, the logistics, all functioning exactly as they have at the end of every empire. The institutions don't change because the requirements don't change. You need explosives that scale. You need fuel that flows. You need credit that extends. You need systems that prevent loss. You need infrastructure that maintains presence. These needs are identical whether you're Rome fighting Parthia, Britain holding India, or modern powers contesting sea lanes and frozen tundra. The technology updates, the names rotate, but the structure remains. Global military spending hit 2.7 trillion in 2024. Projections say it could reach 6.6 trillion by 2035. That's not preparation for expansion. That's preparation for holding position, for preventing loss, for enforcing claims that can't be justified economically or ideologically anymore. When empires could grow through trade and innovation, military spending stayed proportional. When growth stops, spending accelerates, because territory becomes the only remaining proof of power. This is the moment we're in. Multiple great powers fixated on borders, choke points, and strategic zones, each convinced their claims are defensive, each unable to retreat without losing legitimacy, each dependent on the same institutions to sustain commitments that grow more expensive every year. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes with precision. The territorial scrambles at the end of Spanish dominance, British dominance, Soviet dominance, they all looked like rational security policy at the time. In hindsight, they were symptoms of transition, powers fighting to freeze a hierarchy that was already shifting. The fighting didn't preserve their position. It accelerated their decline by consuming resources that could have been used for adaptation. The pattern suggests we're watching the same process now, territory mattering more as everything else matters less. And when you see that pattern, you're not watching the beginning of something. You're watching the final stage. The question isn't whether these territorial disputes will escalate. The question is what comes after. Every empire that entered this phase believed they could hold the line indefinitely. Spain thought silver made them permanent. Britain thought the pound and the Royal Navy were unshakable. The Soviets thought nuclear weapons guaranteed survival. They were all wrong. Not because they lacked power, but because they misunderstood what they were fighting. Territory doesn't preserve empires. It distracts from the real work of adaptation. While you're planting flags and building bases, someone else is building the future. The institutions that profit from territorial struggle don't care about your long-term survival. They care about quarterly returns on defense contracts, interest payments on war debt, and supply contracts that renew automatically. They'll keep supplying as long as you keep borrowing, and you'll keep borrowing as long as you believe holding ground equals holding power. But history shows something else. The powers that survive transitions aren't the ones who fought hardest for territory. They're the ones who let go early enough to reinvent themselves. The ones who realized that clinging to symbolic land was burning the resources they needed for actual transformation. When you see great powers locked in territorial disputes, you're not watching strength. You're watching the final argument of empires that have run out of better ideas. The fight over land is what happens right before someone else writes the next chapter.